Hey guys, so what I did for this video is survey the players in the Blue Eyes White Dragon Duelist Discord just to get their thoughts on the key strengths and weaknesses of the deck and much more. And this is actually a deck that I personally started playing myself, so I have my own 2 cents to share as well. But definitely a huge thanks to those 29 players that did respond to the survey. Really appreciate it, and definitely go check me out on Twitter so you don't miss out on any future surveys. Also, as always, definitely go check out those discount codes for Yu-Gi-Oh! Singles as well as supplies, all of that information down below. Alright, so let's just get to the results of the survey, and I also want to highlight that I did ask which kind of version of Blue Eyes the player was running, for example, Primite or let's say Buster Blade or Invoked. For the most part, majority of the responses were Primite based, but I am still sort of collating all of the responses together in this video, but I will try to make some comments for some of the other variants as well. Anyways, in terms of how difficult it is to pilot this deck, it came to around an average of around 5 out of 10, which is pretty fair and I think reasonable because it is known to be a pretty linear and easy deck to learn and pick up. And so at least for the core lines of play, there's of course some nuances here and there like any other deck, but I would say, for someone like me who's not the best at learning very combo heavy decks, this one just felt really right and was very easy to pick up. Now in terms of the consistency of the deck, they put it around 7.7. Now keep in mind, of course, for some of the other surveys that I've done with, let's say, Mermail, Raziel, Malice, they're not the same players for the most part responding to these surveys, so it's hard to directly compare the scores, maybe somewhat of the trends, but at the same time, I think the deck is pretty consistent. It does have a lot of non-engine space, which we'll get to, that where you can still brick on them, kind of similar to the issue of, let's say, like Raziel, for example. But I would say by and large it has a lot of pretty strong consistency cards. Now in terms of what tier the players would categorize this deck, there were actually a quarter saying it's tier 1, but majority in tier 2. Essentially, if there was like a tier 1.5, maybe you could sort of put it there to be fair, but I would say this is pretty reasonable to see. So in terms of the key strengths of the deck, and I'll sort of go over some of the more common themes for all the blue-white versions, and then I'll also make my own notes in terms of some of the other variants, at least from my own experience as well as a survey. But for one, the strong grind game probably comes up the most, especially when you open the Primate engine, because essentially they keep coming back. In the standby phase, you can add back the barrel as long as you have like the Blue Eyes Engraver field. You have, let's say, Drill Beam, which you can just set back again if you have the barrel on the field. True Light, constantly special summoning or setting, that really is strong in the grind game, and just very hard to play this deck beyond multiple turns if you're trying to go against Blue Eyes. It does play through a lot of singular hand traps pretty well. So for example, let's say like Valor or Imperm or even Ash sometimes, especially on the normal summon, for example, you probably can eat that. Something like Shifter, of course, is very tough. You have something, let's say, non-engine space. I kind of talked about that earlier. You can play a lot of hand traps, which is definitely nice, and it can actually even search effect failure, or even use it as a way to sort of extend as well, which is really cool. And then sort of like the dual play style, you can go combo, but for the most part, I think people are playing more control style. You have some back row and just hand traps as well. Not a lot of monster presence for the most part, but definitely there are different ways of playing this deck, which is what's great. I would say from my own experience, when you talk about, let's say, the Invoke variant, which is also a popular rogue-ish more option, where the strength is that Mechaba serves as like a monster negate. I'm going to talk about Mechaba a little bit later in the weakness section, but essentially providing you an insulation against Nibiru, and then you can sort of not have to worry about that. Maybe if you open really well, could even open like double spirits without even having to worry about Nibiru, just because you have Mechaba. With the Buster Blader version, the strength is that, well, the Buster Blader lock, where essentially you sort of turn your opponent's monsters into dragons. The big guy essentially makes it so your opponent can't activate any effects in their possession that are dragons, so it can be really strong. On top of that, they can even do the Destruction Sword lock, which is essentially you can't access the extra deck, which for those of you who played during like the early pandemic era with Dragon Link and that Buster lock with Union Carrier, you're going to remember and be a little bit traumatized there. So in terms of the end board and how they were rated going first, they put around average an 8.5 out of 10. Sometimes it can be really oppressive, like especially if they were able to actually pull off double Spirit Dragon without getting the beard, for example, and then you have, let's say, possibly the trap for the pops, and we're going to get to like the typical end board as well, but the Primate stuff as well. Drill Beam is a very strong card, not to mention they likely have at least one hand trap in their hand as well, so it can be pretty good unless you bricked, of course, because you are playing some Blue Eyes White Dragons. Now as for going second though, it was rated only 6 out of 10, and this is definitely understandable. Its ability to go second is definitely, it's a little inconsistent, I think is the best way to put it. There are times where you can really just clear everything, and maybe even OTK as well because of True Light specialing like Blue Eyes and everything, but there are other times where, like your opponent could have just nothing and you struggle to even get like maybe just one monster and poke, and that's kind of all you can do sometimes, so it's a little bit interesting for sure. Now in terms of the typical end board, card that you end on with this deck. So a lot of the responses, for example, so let's go through it slowly. The main one you're always most likely going to see most of the time is Blue Eyes Spirit Dragon, at least one. So essentially it can negate any graveyard effect, and then they'll probably tag out, and we'll talk about the tag out options later. If they do open the Primat engine, or maybe they just open Drill Beam and then they have access to Blue Eyes White Dragon, for example, then they have this just Omni Negate essentially. It does target, so sometimes if your opponent like droplets away that card that you try to target with Drill Beam, then that kind of sucks. But it is still a really, really strong card. True Light on itself isn't going to serve as an interruption. It does, though, however, keep on, let's say, bringing back that Blue Eyes, which can be relevant if you have a Drill Beam that you need the Blue Eyes White Dragon to be around. And then also, for example, being able to set for follow-up. And then, of course, one of the best sets, at least as a disruption, is the Trap, which is a non-targeting pop, usually at least one, right? But maybe even two if you're lucky. Now, in terms of some of the tag out options, so you have the main one would be Blue Eyes Ultimate Spirit Dragon, which is sort of an Omni Negate. At least that's whatever's on the field. Unfortunately, you cannot negate Nibiru with this one. You do have a back row pop option with Lightstorm Dragon, can be 2 to 3 back row pops depending on how many Blue Eyes you have in your graveyard. And then, of course, you have some people, not all, play Moonlight, which essentially serves as like a bounce. I would say the first two you definitely see in every single list. The third one, not as much, but definitely a good amount that you should at least be familiar with. Also, quick note, whatever Lightstorm Dragon sets after it's destroyed, for example, when you summon it off Spirit Dragon, it's going to get destroyed in the end phase. That set card can only be activated if you control a normal monster, so definitely keep that in mind. Now, some of the other end board pieces, sometimes you might have a Spirit and Hieratic Seal. There's actually technically hands where you could make double Spirit and Hieratic Seal, but you're probably overextending at that point by far. Now, a lot of times though, when you're seeing Hieratic Seal hit the floor is more so on its own, because sometimes they just open like the Primat engine and that's kind of it, and then just end on this, and then some, you know, like let's say Drill Beam and like probably hand traps. Now, if they do go for the double Spirit Dragon play, they're most likely bringing out, let's say, Ultimate for the first tag out, and then the other one will go into Crimson Dragon, and then you have some options like Cosmic Blazar or Cypher. So there are some positives to each. The Cypher one is good because it actually protects from destruction, like once essentially each, so that with the Spirit Dragon, when it tries to destroy it, it'll protect it, which is kind of really neat. The Blazar Dragon, where I find it can be very strong, is its ability to actually negate summons, which if you had to really pick an option in terms of interruptions, like being able to negate a summon is the one that I would say really can be a turn ender compared to, let's say, one Omni Negate. Nowadays probably isn't enough, but I do really like that summon negating option. But a lot of people will argue that, you know, going to the double Spirit line is, and especially with Crimson Dragon, is playing very greedy, and definitely there are some merits to that too. So now, in terms of which hand traps played by the opponent is most impactful against Blue Eyes White Dragon, so you can kind of use it as a side deck guide. So here you see Shifter, of course, is number one. It's going to be the case for a lot of decks, you know, not being able to even activate Maiden Effect because it has to go to grave as cost. That really, really hurts for sure. So it's not completely turn ending like it would be some for other decks, because let's say you can at least set up something like Hieratic Seal, for example. It's not much. You still have some hand traps, which, to be fair, something like Veiler would also be dead under Shifter, but it is definitely very powerful. Bisque Shields as well. Usually people will Bisque Shield the Maiden as it tries to revive, but if you actually have multiple Bisque Shields and you just get rid of both Blue Eyes, it's kind of game ending. They do have Roar that they can bring from the Banished as well, but, you know, for the most part, everyone's only playing one of that, so if they did go through that and then you get rid of all their Blue Eyes, it's going to be very, very tough for them. Ash is good on particular wishes, especially let's say they lead off with that. So like there are times where it's not as good. I mean, even on load, so that it prevents them from getting access to, let's say, the Drill Beam. Sure, that definitely happens, and in which case then if they also have wishes, then it kind of sucks, but it is definitely an option. Nibiru is decent. It essentially, there's no way for this deck to actually negate Nibiru on its own, other than the Invoke version, of course. You sort of have to just eat it, and then there are times where you can just keep extending, you use True Light, set wishes, and then continue again, and you just make another Spirit Dragon. But I would say it's solid, but it's maybe not as absolutely game-ending as maybe one might believe, because they will still have other interruptions on top of just like the Spirit that they're losing, essentially, if you get Nibiru'd. Ogre on True Light is essentially the best one, where True Light, it does have to nuke the field. It is also a mandatory effect. It will be Chain Link 1. Now, keep in mind, even though Spirit can negate the nuke effect from True Light in the graveyard, if they use Lordly Load effect that turn to special summon a Blue Eyes White Dragon, they cannot actually activate effects of special summon monsters on the field. So if that actually happened, and then you Ogre their True Light, they can't use Spirit to try to protect. They're not going to be able to activate that effect, so that's where it can get very, very deadly, that you should be aware of. Fuwalu's, Molchamis in general, it's okay, you'll get one draw, most likely. Sometimes you could even pass on not having them draw anything because let's say you have access to Drill Beam already, some hand traps, maybe it's good enough. So it's decent, but it's definitely not amazing for sure. Impulse, I mean, why not? It's still solid, being able to negate. There's a lot of things that special summon in this deck, so really nice. Imperm can be good, especially usually like the barrel will eat that as well as any kind of like link one. The spirit to try to add the field spell usually gets hit as well. Droll is actually pretty solid, I'd say, but again, not turn ending. They can definitely make some plays, especially if they have like, you know, the Primate stuff. You can at least like make seals. You still have a lot of follow-up, or rather grind game as well. So in terms of the board breakers, so Super Poly, definitely, especially if people actually do go for like the double spirit line. At one point, they are going to, let's say, tag out, right, and go into ultimate, and then you have the spirit. Or even if it was just one spirit, they may special summon out the blue eyes, do the true light on your opponent's turn, just so they get their drill beam live, and then you can still Super Poly that away. Luckily, there's not actually that much Super Poly going on in this current format, but we've definitely seen this not that long ago. Lightning Storm Feather Duster is basically there to just like blow away the back row, because a lot of times people will not tag out their Spirit Dragon right away to go into the ultimate for that Omni Negate, because they want to try to maximize the value out of Spirit Dragon by being able to, let's say, negate the opponent's grave effect and then tag out, which can be punished if you do get hit with something like Lightning Storm, Feather Duster. But again, you might have Drill Beam anyway, so that they can just negate that part. And same thing can be said for Ultimate Slayer. It can be good, but there are times it can't. For example, if they have to start with the Ultimate Slayer on the Spirit Dragon because they need some kind of like grave effect or something, and then your opponent could just chain True Light, so it's a trap, and then chain, let's say, Spirit Dragon to tag out and dodge that. Or again, you might just have Drill Beam anyways. Lava Golem, sure, why not? As I mentioned, you're probably having either Double Spirit or Spirit plus Blue Eyes Maiden, in which case Sphere Mode could technically work, but you know, these cards really, you're not seeing any meta decks right now being able to play this. Dark Ruler, Droplet, sure, I guess being able to negate the monster effect, but this, again, all comes around Drill Beam. If it's there, it's going to be able to actually stop these things evenly matched, as well, even easier to stop because, of course, you have to go into the battle phase, so it just completely telegraphs it, and so that they can just tag out the Spirit Dragon to just negate that. Now, in terms of Floodgates, D-Fissure, Macrocosmos, anything like D-Shifter kind of thing, same thing for different Dimension Ground, definitely really strong. There can be only one. We don't really see this right now in the format, but of course this deck is just all dragons, all spellcasters, but you do have to sort of go through each other to get there, and definitely hurts. Deck lockdown. Centurion is really the only relevant deck that typically plays this right now, but you're not seeing much of Centurion anyways. Anti-spell, yes, you know, there's definitely some spells in this deck, but as long as you can get to like True Light and then you set the trap, I mean, it does take a while to get there to pop it, but at least the option is there if your opponent is only sitting on anti-spell and hoping to win out that way. And then something, let's say like Necro Valley, it's another Floodgate you don't actually see, but you do have something like, let's say, Maiden trying to come back. You have something like, let's say, Blue Eyes, the Spirit Link that can also special from Grave as well, that you just wouldn't be able to do under Necro Valley. And so a lot of applications, but fortunately not actually seeing that much play right now. Also, I want to talk about D-Barrier. So yes, it's a synchro-based deck, but they also have a lot of, let's say, link-based cards, and not to mention, especially since D-Barrier, you know, of course, the opponent who's going first is playing this, Blue Eyes going second, the Tyrant Dragon play is definitely a lot more desirable, and that's a fusion. So they do have a lot of plays around that. Alright, so in terms of the weaknesses of the deck, and this is going to be more of a summary for all Blue Eyes variants, but I'll also try my best to sort of highlight some of the weaknesses of some other versions, at least that I've tested out, as well as based on the survey as well. So going second is pretty difficult. As I mentioned, you know, the score A was 6 out of 10. Even if your opponent just had one detonator, let's say you play evenly for some reason and they just keep the detonator, that alone will still destroy Blue Eyes if they only open engine alone. Like with multiple pops, will just absolutely cook this deck. So it really sucks, as I mentioned, about sort of the inconsistent OTK. There are times you have big bodies and it's easy, but then other times you find yourself where it's an open board and you only have one monster to really poke into, and then eventually set up seals and pass. So that is where I do find it a little bit challenging. It does play several bricks. You do have to play 2 Blue Eyes White Dragon, and also not to mention bricking on non-engine, which is at least better than just bricking on absolutely unplayable cards. I've definitely been in situations where I only open like hand traps or whatever interruption, and I was able to still survive, and then the next turn I draw into engine and then kind of go off from there. So it's not unique to Blue Eyes, of course. You see this happen a lot with Ryziel or any decks in the modern era where there's just too much non-engine being played, but it is something you do have to be mindful of depending on your deck choice. So next being True Light being a liability. It's a great card. It can provide insane grind game, but let's say you did go through like your interruptions already, and then even something like Fiend Smith, Desiree, this happens a lot where it can just send a True Light, and then now you just have to out that True Light to also clear all the monsters on the field because of its nuke effect. So it can definitely be a hindrance. As I mentioned earlier, yes, Spirit Dragon can negate it, but if you did use, let's say, something like the load effect to special summon that turn, you're not going to be able to use the Spirit Dragon to negate, so then you just kind of completely lose your board. So there are some downsides to that. Bestials, which is pretty prevalent, especially with Malice right now. Shifter, also, again, because of Malice, any kind of graveyard hate definitely can be pretty hard into this deck. Now, in terms of weaknesses for some of the other versions in particular, for example, I've tested Invoked. One of the main weaknesses for that is that the Invoked engine honestly feels pretty underwhelming. And don't get me wrong, I'm someone that normal summoned Alistair even until late 2022, which is essentially 2 years late compared to when they were actually meta. And even in 2022, I remember thinking to myself, Mechaba is really ass. And I was just kind of surprised how this was ever tier 1. And, you know, in 2025, that still holds true, maybe even worse. Even though Mechaba is an Omni negate, almost always it will only be a monster negate just because of what you have to discard, and you're also most likely discarding the Alistair that you just added back because the other cards in your hand are probably hand traps that you also have to keep. So then you lose sort of the recursion of the Invoked engine by pitching that Alistair, and it's really just there for the most part for the monster negate in Nibiru. So that's where I find it kind of weak in that regard, where when you open Primate Engine, it feels honestly pretty strong on its own, and you know the recursion is there. With the Invoke stuff, not really. I mean, Mechaba honestly just feels like Paul George on the 76ers, just really washed. In terms of the Buster Blader version, the biggest weakness for that is that it's very bricky. The deck is already bricky with blue eye stuff, right? On top of that, now you have to add more bricks, and it's like legitimate breaks because the prologue trap has to actually send from deck to grave, so not from hand or field if you happen to have it. And so when you draw the other trap, for example, Destruction Sword Memories, you have to find a way to discard that, which, yes, there's wishes, but at the same time, you don't always get to wishes. And then if you draw the Buster Blader, the combo also gets kind of awkward as well. And on top of that, being more trap-based, going second becomes a little weaker, rather much weaker as well for the Buster Blader version I found. The ones that did top with the Buster Blader, so you do have to respect it, but it did still play the Primate stuff, so purely from a cost perspective, it doesn't really help there. Anyways, guys, that was it for the survey breakdown for Blue Eyes White Dragon. So hopefully you did find that interesting. Again, huge thanks to those of you who did respond to the survey and take the time to do that. I really do appreciate it. This video would not be made without your guys' input. So definitely, if you are on Twitter, follow me so you don't miss out on these surveys for whatever new meta decks that will be coming along the pipeline. So anyways, huge thanks to all of you for watching. Big thanks to my patrons and sponsors for the continued support as always. Well, take care, guys.